Okay, so very quickly, in terms of public service reform in Ireland over the years, there have been various criticisms about how we organise ourselves. Indeed, even this morning with Robert referencing the 19th century configurations of how our local government system is organised, issues around having a largely rural-driven policy, or depending on where you stand, largely an urban-driven policy, or indeed a lack of both. Ongoing management reconfiguration is very much associated with how we structure ourselves as public services over the last 20, 30 years. Key elements of that, of course, is the Strategic Management Initiative that Julie would have been associated with. But in essence, relatively little structural change. And I always refer to the likes of Arthur Balfour coming back after 90 years of nearly 100 years now of independence, and having a degree of comfort with some of the structures that he would find here in Ireland relative to some of the structures that might be found in other parts of the OECD. A key issue, again, which has been highlighted over the course of the morning, is that a lot of our public services and policies associated with that traditionally were very disaggregated. It was very difficult to breach the silos that we have in place for our public structures, both at local but also as much at national level. And again, it's been highlighted, underdeveloped systems of accountability and quite a lot of concealed administration. And we've seen very recent examples of that. In fact, there's now a full theory in administrative thinking in terms of concealed administration, of nobody necessarily being identifiable in terms of decisions being taken and policies being developed, and then everybody wonders how something actually happened. And we often find ministers staring into camera saying, well, don't look at me, I'm only the minister. But notwithstanding that, I think it's also fair to say that when we get more evidence-based review of public service reconfiguration here in Ireland, the picture is actually pretty positive, I think, and it's probably not said often enough. So even the most recent review of the OECD talked about the improvements that have been there in terms of the last 5-10 years in public service delivery, and are now encouraging and challenging the public services in Ireland to focus on achieving measurable outcomes in terms of public service reform, embedding evidence and data-driving approaches. Again, referencing back to what Robert was saying, strengthening governance arrangements, and critically within that, driving public service innovation. I want to touch in on some of those subjects in the context of our public service changes. But I do want to iterate here this morning, in a recent review published by the European Commission, the Irish public service actually comes out very strongly in terms of general performances across areas of mandate that falls within the public sphere in Ireland relative to other public services. So, the Irish public service there, not only has it improved its performance over the last number of years, last 5 years, but has actually sustained a high level of performance relative to other public services. And that's not necessarily always appreciated in the wider population. And it does so at a time when it actually has a relatively low impact in cost terms to the overall economy. So again, notwithstanding the quality of performance, an awful lot of which is very good. Obviously there are key challenges, which we'll come back to. The general costs associated with our public services here is among, if not the lowest, in the European Union. Again, a point worth reflecting upon and thinking about. Now, with all of that background in mind, also useful in terms of presentations this morning to look at our population trends. And depending on who you look at, a population might grow to anything up to 5.8 million by 2040, or indeed some are more extreme in terms of going into 6.3 million, with workforce potentially in the order of about 3 million people. Now, what's interesting about that is that we are coming back to levels of population that we had pre the Great Famine of the 1840s. So essentially it's taken us to 200 years to make up for the impact, the very disruptive impact, to paraphrase Stephen, to our society back in the 1840s. But we also have to be very careful with population projections, which again has been iterated here a few times. Back in 1999, July 1999, CSO, using best practice at the time, reckoned that by 2031 we'd have a population of 4.7 million people. Our population of 4.7 million was passed 2 years ago, essentially, and we're now in and around 4.9 million people. What's also interesting to look at is that the background and the makeup of those people. Back in 1996, 93% of the population were born in Ireland. That's now fallen to 82%, 82.5% in 2016. UK, interestingly enough, although albeit obviously much greater numbers because the actual overall increase in population was such, but 5.9%. And within that, Northern Ireland, there's quite a low transfer of residents out of Northern Ireland into the Republic over the 50, 60, 70 years that are reflected in these figures here. What is interesting, of course, is that the impact of population migration into the country from the rest of the European Union, which is quite dramatic, as you can see there, going from 0.1% to 6.3%. The USA doubling, but actually relatively low in percentage terms, and the rest of the world going from 0.1% to 4.9%. So what we have now is a much more diverse population, reflective of the growth in the economy, the wealth of the economy, the opportunities presented within the economy. All of which suggests, of course, that will continue to be the case, predicated on some of the facts and figures which Ronan and Marie will have pointed out already. So with that as a background, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting now to stand back and look at it in the context of the public service and with growth of the public service. So in 1999, with a population of 3.7 million people, we had 226,000 public servants. By 2017, it was almost 4.8 million people. That had grown to 315,000 public servants. So that's an increase in the order of 89,000 people. And within that, we see growth rates in the order of 60% and 57% in health. No surprise there, given the demographic-driven elements associated with the need for additional people in education and in health. And lesser growth rates in the civil service and state bodies, almost no growth at all in local government, which is interesting, notwithstanding the increased role in more recent times that local government has been given, and a very significant reduction in the level of employment within defence, which in a sense you might associate with, for example, the peace process in Northern Ireland and a reduced need for military. Whether that argument stacks up when you look at a 16% increase in numbers of people employed in justice, maybe not. But what it does point to is the very significant demographic push that arises from the need to sustain and maintain and grow services in citizen-centred need, particularly in areas like health and education, because of the demand for teachers, special needs assistants, doctors, nurses, and so on. So if you were to look at it in that context, to just take a simple, and there's no science behind any of this, but simply to look at it in the context of where we might go into the future by 2040, coming back to the challenges associated with, for example, the construction sector, etc., etc. But if we were to simply sustain the sort of trends in public service employment that are beginning to set in train at the moment, to meet the sort of demands that are growing with the population of potentially up to 6.3 million, you're looking at having over 100,000 extra public servants employed by 2040. Now that may seem like a mad figure. I'm sure if we quoted that to Robert, he'd be on the way to Beaumont at the moment, to the A&E. But the reality is, in fact, is that our trends are already in place in terms of achieving those sorts of figures in extra employment in the public service. The budget that was adopted only in the last fortnight has provided for over 5,000 additional public service jobs across the core elements of the public service. This is not including arm's length services. So we have 100,000 extra people potentially in and around. Now that could vary, could drop down to 80,000, go to 120,000, whatever figures you want to quote. But in essence, we are talking about a very, very significant increase, which in a sense is already established through historical trend. So, with that in mind, what else do we have to think about? Well, the simple reality is that when we look at the age profile of our public service, it's an ageing profile, as is unfortunately evident in some of us in the room today. But just taking the civil service itself, 73% of civil service are 40 years of age or over, which basically means that they're going to be retiring, assuming they're allowed to retire, over the next 10, 15 years. Our ageing population itself, broadly speaking, is going to be up by at least 1 million people by 2040. So we've got to start thinking in terms of the impact of having an older, hopefully wiser, potentially wealthier population alongside, a still growing younger population as well, all reinforcing the challenges that both Marie and Ronan pointed out in regard to issues of housing, healthcare, etc. So we're looking at potentially up to 25,000 civil servants retiring by 2040. Retirements are expected to grow. There's a really good paper which was produced by the Irish Economic Evaluation Service of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, one of the really good changes that came in over the last decade. Looking at specifically the numbers, and we're ranging from 1,750 employees retiring in 2019 up to 2,500 in 2025 and thereafter in the order of 2.2 thousand. Local government is broadly similar, so we are going to see very significant cliffs being confronted by our local authorities over the next 10 years in particular in regard to retirements. So approximately 9,000 people will be retiring in local government from figures that I've seen. And in the HSE, which is the core HSE itself, which employs in the order of 70,000 people, 21% are over 55 years of age. The average age in HSE is 45 years old. So again, a significant drop. So on top of that 100,000-ish that we may need just to keep services standing still, we're looking at potentially another 140,000 people retiring unless we change how we manage work for that workforce over the next 10, 15 years. All of which is on top of the sorts of absorption requirements in construction, etc., etc., etc. So can the workforce actually keep pace with the challenges confronting us? By the way, this has also implications for the political arena. I'll assume we will still have one president by 2040. Might necessarily be the current president, but it'll certainly be a different president, one would imagine, given the 2 terms that presidents can have. But for councillors, we've gone through a reform exercise only in the last couple of years, which has seen the reduction of our town councils and the instigation of municipal districts. That has resulted in a significant reduction in numbers of councillors down to 949. Just taking population trends alone, we could be back up at nearly 1,300 councillors by 2040. And TDs, going from 158 TDs, just simply reflecting the constitutional requirements, up to 210 TDs. We might need to start looking for a new building for the elected representatives of the state at national level. I'll assume that the senators will still have them, notwithstanding various efforts to get rid of the Senate over the last couple of years. So all of that presents a picture in broad terms of considerable pressures in regard to the employment of and the scale of our public services, confronting the delivery of an NPF, NDP, which is itself now going to have to be confronted with further pressures because of the ongoing increased trends in population. And one of the issues that has been put out, coming back again to the point Marie and Ronan have made, is that we could potentially import people to build the houses and so on. And yes, we could. But if we import people to build those houses, and they will be needed, then we import the service demands that go with importing those people in terms of people having families, education requirements, healthcare requirements, and so on. So it is a double-edged sword in some respects in terms of the resource demand to meet, the housing needs of those that are coming in, because this isn't going to change. We're not going to bring in 10,000 construction workers from Eastern Europe. They may not actually be available to us given the scale of growth in those economies, by the way. So if we're going to bring in those sorts of numbers of people to add to our construction resource to continue the building out, they in turn need housing accommodation, and it will be long-term accommodation requirements, long-term service demands, long-term pension obligations, etc. So where are we? One of the weaknesses, it might be argued, in the National Planning Framework is that we don't fully appreciate or embed the impact potentially of the fourth industrial revolution, Internet of Things, and advancing of various new technologies, which may provide us with an opportunity to maybe temper those sorts of growth rates in terms of public services, but also growth rates in terms of construction workers coming in, etc. We need to more fully address the ageing of our society, ensuring that we have people who are now expecting reasonably well to live to 85 plus. There was a time, certainly when I started out in the public service back in very early 80s, where retirement was expected to be maybe 2-3 years in some cases. From memory in the civil service, and I can be corrected on this, it was less than a year that one had a life expectancy after retirement. Now the expectation is reasonable because people are healthier, fitter, with better living conditions, are expecting to live too, as I say, into their mid-80s. So we've seen an extraordinary improvement in that. So given that population, to what extent can we now begin to examine how we actually deliver our public services, to draw upon that wealth of experience and knowledge with a view to continuing to sustain and grow our public services? Robert mentioned this morning the issue of the Skills Academy and the creation of new skills. And certainly from looking at reviews that have been done of public services in other parts of the OECD, we are looking at a very radical shift in the skills platform that will be required for future public services. In fact, many of the skills that are inherent within our current public service will not necessarily be fit for purpose for those skills requirements that are confronting us, even in the immediate future, 5 to 10 years, adjusting to use of robotics, etc., etc. So we require a new public service. And the good thing about the requirement of this new public service is that, at least in policy development terms, we're beginning to see that understanding beginning to embed itself, certainly through our Public Service 2020, which is trying to create a public service that has the capacity to solve complex problems, enhance people management, addressing human factors and the interface with technology at a level that was never previously attempted, not just here in Ireland, but generally across the OECD. Sustaining quality public services are people-centred. Now, one of the benefits for Ireland is that because of the competitive advantage, if you like, that's given to us by our demographic profile, we have a reasonably short window of opportunity to engage fully with this process and to reconfigure how we organise ourselves in public service terms in the immediate future. And that's why we begin to see things like strategic HR management becoming a critical part now of the role of all parts of public service, with hopefully that being further emphasised through our 2020 document. In saying all of that, there are the ongoing challenges for our public service over the next 10-15 years. Population spread across the island of Ireland has already been reflected. There can be, one can underestimate the impact that this is having in terms of the cultural shift that is going to be required in political terms in particular. And as Ronan highlighted there, is this going to impact more on our third-tier towns and cities relative to their relationship with the second-tier cities, rather than Dublin and indeed Belfast? Cross-border development in light of Brexit, it goes without saying. Creating the processes, given the change that is challenging us and going to challenge us, and in fact has challenged us over the last 20 years in particular, but I think we addressed it very much on an ad hoc basis. Having a clear level of civic engagement and participation of a wider population so that people can begin to appreciate the future challenges that are coming at us rather than looking at the legacies of the past. So we do need very significant shifts in how we configure our public services and in how we deliver our public services. And for that to happen, we need a very, very significant shift in how we actually create the competencies and capabilities of our public servants, many of whom are highly educated, maybe doing humdrum jobs, and needing to get the freedom to move outside of that quite strict regime that can be in place, to enable the flexibility to respond to the sort of service demands that are being created on an ongoing basis. As I say, there's a positive in the sense that for the first time, and I'm engaged in this whole area for the last 35 odd years, we are now beginning to see connections being made, to quote Julie, and joining the dots. The dots are finally beginning to be joined. That's the positive thing about this. That when we look at our Public Service 2020 document and the longer public service reform framework that Robert and his colleagues have been pushing forward over the last couple of years, and in particular over the last 18 months, we begin to see a very clear relationship between that, at least in policy terms, with the National Planning Framework and the National Development Plan. So that's a very positive thing. However, the weakness there is, of course, is the relationship between our Public Service 2020 and the shifts that may be required in cultural terms of our political process in particular, but also within our senior public service. So there is certainly a positive direction set out and being proposed by the Public Policy Reform document of 2020, and indeed into the longer term over into 2027. Is it enough is the question that may be put forward. And I think certainly in terms of the commentary coming through from Marie and from Robert and Stephen, that this may not be enough. And perhaps what is required in addition to this is a clear understanding that these figures of growth and population, these demographic trends and population changes, are not set in stone. And we need to have a sufficient flexibility about how we design our policy and implement our policy, and particularly review our policy, to make sure that the changes that are necessary are going to be made on an ongoing basis and not on a 5-yearly, 6-yearly basis, as very often is the case when it comes down to things like development planning, for example. So, clear major challenge to align growth of the population and related demographic factors to the delivery of National Planning Framework, National Development Plan, and all the implications that go within that and the skills requirements around that. It means that we have to have a clear view on the transition of our public services. And part of that clear view, and I'm not necessarily sure that this has been fully understood or embedded into the thought processes of our senior public service, or indeed more critically our senior political leaders, that we're now moving from a period of austerity into trying to create the capacity and resources within our public services generally to meet with existing demographic demands and future demographic demands and a growing urbanised population. That is a huge cultural shift that's going to be required of all of those that are charged with developing and implementing policy at all levels of government here in Ireland. And I'm not even thinking in terms of, as somebody once said in the last few days, discussing it at senior civil service level, said to me, "But sure, Sean, they'll be getting rid of all the civil servants in Northern Ireland with the downsizing of the Northern Irish civil service. Couldn't we recruit there?" But unfortunately, when you look at the profile of the public service in Northern Ireland, the issues and challenges are probably even worse. So I'm afraid that's not necessarily a resource that's going to be available to us, with the odd exception of police commissioners and Garda commissioners and so on, perhaps. Okay, so I think what's an important message to take out from today is that reform and change of our public service now is a fundamental element of that ongoing transition over the next 10-15 years. It's not going to stop when we've got to the end of 2020 and we have our public service 2020 fully implemented. So, again, I think it's a key message coming through from everybody today is spending needs to be coordinated with spatial planning, but crucially it also needs to be coordinated with our public service reconfiguration and the structures. And having the tools in place to allow that to happen, I think, is going to be a huge challenge to us. It's not insurmountable, and frankly, it's a challenge I would prefer to be having than the challenge we've had 5-10 years ago in terms of austerity, and also, quite frankly, sorts of challenges that public services in other parts of the OECD are having to confront because they do not have the window of opportunity that we have in terms of the demographic process that's out there at the moment. Now, here's just a mad thought to finish on, and this is totally unrelated to what Ronan was saying earlier, but in 1849, the population of the Netherlands was 3.1 million. It's now 17 million. So on that basis, we should have around 35 million people living in Ireland. Okay, so think about it. There are, you know, I don't know if anybody saw the Black 47 film. It's a great film. If you can go and see it, I strongly recommend it. But, you know, if that hadn't happened, if it hadn't taken us 200 years to get back to the population levels that we had pre-famine, we would be looking at one of the most densely populated populations in Western Europe, and we'd have densities on a par with what you find in the Netherlands and Israel, etc. Clearly, if you had that growth, even over 100 years, public services would be very severely challenged. But in fact, when we look at the long-term trends, okay, I'm not necessarily saying we're going to have 35 million people in 100 years' time, but when we look at the long-term trends of population change and development, we are looking at very, very significant increases in population that will be very urbanised. So we either start getting this right now, or we sit back and let it happen to us. And if we sit back and let it happen to us, one thing I can pretty well guarantee is that we will look back in 2040 on having 10,000 homeless people on our list and reflect upon that as being the good old days. Thanks very much.